Welcome to the Gridiron Expert. I'm Connor Hibbett. We're going to be looking at the Ohio State Buckeyes today, and joining me on the channel is Dan Hope. Dan, thanks for being on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, Dan, before we get into the Ohio State Buckeyes, please tell us your affiliation with the Buckeyes and where our viewers can find your content.
Yeah, so I am the deputy editor for 11 Warriors, so you can find my content over at 11warriors.com. That's Eleven spelled out warriors.com. And we cover all things Ohio State all year round. So if you're looking for Ohio State football content, please come check us out.
And by the way, guys, Dan is one of the best beat writers out there for the Buckeyes. So we are sure to have some great insight on the team today. So when you look at Ohio State this year, by the way, congratulations, defending national champion. So y'all reached the mountain peak. So congratulations again on that. When you look at the roster for this year, obviously a lot of pieces from last year's team have moved on, NFL draft, some graduation. But let's start at the quarterback position. It's Julian Sayin time. And so what's his floor and what's his ceiling as a first year starter for the Buckeyes?
Well, I think his ceiling is very high. I think you look at someone who came in to Ohio State as the number one overall quarterback in his recruiting class. Now, I think, first of all, he's still got to go up there and he's still got to go win the job in preseason camp. Ryan Day admitted in his post-spring press conference that, Lincoln Keenholz had the lead over Julian Sayin going into the spring game. I think Julian had a really good spring game and that kind of put him back on track to where, he, has a good chance to be the starting quarterback this year. But, I think there was some inconsistency this spring. I think, he struggled a little bit at times when he had to deal with, pressure in those live situations. And so I think he's got to prove in preseason camp that, he's ready for the bright lights because, there's a big difference between, being able to make all the throws in practice and then being able to go do it when you're in the stadium with 100,000 people and you've got 300-pound guys are rushing at you. So I think that's the big question with Julian is just, is he ready just for, that jump? I mean, he only played in a few games at the very end of games last year. Now he's likely the starting quarterback at Ohio State. So it's a big difference than someone like Will Howard coming in with all the experience that he had a year ago. So I think, I think the floor is lower than it was with a Will Howard because of the fact that he's never started a college game before. I think the ceiling's very high. I mean, it might be higher than Will Howard, but I think that there's a little bit, there's a little bit wider variance of what you might get here because he is somebody who's never started at the collegiate level before.
And so because of his inexperience, what are you expecting his workload to be early on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, obviously if you're Ohio State, you go into that first game against Texas, like you can't that you have to take the training wheels off right away for no matter who the quarterback is. Like you can't kind of baby a guy out there because you're going to be playing one of the best teams in the country in week one. And so ultimately, what's the game plan going to look like? It's going to be whatever gives Ohio State the best chance to go beat Texas in week one. But I think certainly, if you're Ohio State, you're going to try to design things offensively that you're not forcing Julian to do everything by himself because you've got so many weapons. I mean, you got Jeremiah Smith, you got Carnell Tate, you got Brandon Inniss, you got Max Clare, you've got some good running backs. There's plenty of weapons around Julian Sayin to make life easier for him. So I think certainly the goal is going to be to create plenty of plays, but allow those very talented receivers to get open and make life easier for Julian.
And when you look at the receivers, I mean, it's no secret. I mean, Jeremiah Smith is that guy. I'm sure you heard he may be the first 100 overall player in the upcoming NCAA football game. And then, of course, you mentioned Carnell Tate, some of the others that transfer tied in from Purdue. Are you expecting him to see the field a lot as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're talking about a guy who was one of the best tight ends in the country last year. So I think he's certainly coming in to play a major role for this offense. Yeah, I think Will Kacmarek is going to continue to have a significant role in the offense as well. I think, Will Kacmarek is probably one of the best blocking tight ends in the country, and Max Clare is probably one of the best receiving tight ends in the country. And so I think you pair those two together. It's not something we've said a whole lot about Ohio State, but I think Ohio State could have the best tight end room in the country this year. I think bringing in Max Clare, pairing him with a really strong group of returning guys like Will Kacmarek, Jelani Furman, Bennett Christian, Nate Roberts. I mean, they're just loaded with depth in that tight end room. And so that's not always a position that's been highlighted a ton in Ohio State's offense. And obviously, you got to compete with some really good wide receivers for targets. But I think that tight end room has a chance to be elite this year.
Yeah, Max Clare coming off of a 51 catch season, as you mentioned, a really good downfield threat. When you look at the running game this year, I mean, Quinshawn Judkins, Trayvon Henderson off to the NFL. CJ Donaldson comes in from West Virginia, James Peoples, Sam Williams Dixon. Is it going to be a three-headed monster here, or do you think CJ Donaldson is going to get the majority of the carries?
I think James Peoples and CJ Donaldson will probably get the majority of the carries. I think they're very high on James Peoples and what he can become. But I think it'll probably be much like last year with what we saw with Henderson and Judkins, where I think you'll probably see a lot of alternation, a lot of rotation between Peoples and Donaldson, trying to keep both of those guys fresh for the stretch run, just like Henderson and Judkins were a year ago. I do think Bo Jackson has a chance to make that a free-headed monster. With what we saw from him this spring coming in as a freshman, he was very impressive. So I do think that there's a chance that Bo Jackson earns his way into that rotation as well, and they end up, rotating three guys instead of just two guys, or even maybe just mixing Bo in for a few plays because I think Bo has that. I think the one thing I'd say if this running back room compared to last year's. I don't know if they quite have that home run hitter that they had with Travion Henderson, but I think Bo Jackson has the potential to be that guy. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a package of plays for Bo Jackson because I think he might be able to add a little bit more of that explosive home run playability.
And the downfield rushing attack you feel is just as high quality in terms of between the tackles.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you look at Peoples and Donaldson. I think they're both guys who are very physical runners, particularly Donaldson. And so, again, is there going to be a guy that I think is quite that Travion Henderson this year in terms of his ability to take any play to the house? I don't know if they're going to quite have that this year, but I think, Peoples and Donaldson are both going to be guys who can kind of give them that physical rushing presence. And I think the interior offensive line has a chance to be a strength for this Ohio State football team with, Luke Montgomery, Carson Hinsman, Tegra Shabola, Austin Sierreveld could potentially play either guard or tackle, but they've got four guys who played a lot of football in that college football playoff last year who are back on the offensive line this year. And so I think that's going to be a big help to the running game too, is I think, those guys with the experience they've gained another offseason of development should be better than they were a year ago.
And so you mentioned the offensive line will transition to it with that statement there. So this was a really group last year, allowing just 14 sacks and only 41 tackles for loss all season long. So Seth McLaughlin, the center, and the tackles are off to the NFL. Both, as you mentioned, the interior is probably going to be the strength this year for the offensive line. They bring back four guys who played a lot of football last year. What do you think? Are there any questions here? Do you like the depth? Are there any questions about the first to second string here?
I think the biggest question right now is who's going to start at right tackle, at left tackle. It's likely going to be Ethan Anianwo, who they brought in as the transfer from Rice. I think kind of the expectation going into spring was that Philip Daniels, who they brought in from Minnesota, or potentially second-year tackle Ian Moore would be that starting right tackle. But I mentioned Austin Sierreveld. He really impressed Ohio State's coaches this spring to the point that Ryan Day said in his post-spring press conference that Austin Sierreveld is going to be a starter on that offensive line. And so whether it's at guard or tackle is uncertain as of now, but he spent most of a spring at tackle, and they seem to like what they saw from him there. And so, you don't know exactly how that will go if they go with that because he hasn't played tackle at the college level. But I think there's a lot of optimism in the kind of player that he can be for Ohio State this year.
Well, that's awesome for them. And obviously, we mentioned the receiving core. They have a ton of upside, per usual. So what is the floor and the ceiling overall for the Ohio State offense this year? Obviously, again, the pass catching department really doesn't have any questions there. They have not had questions there in a very, very long time. The offensive line, running game, and again, we discussed Julian saying, what's the expectation this year for the Buckeyes offense overall?
Yeah, I mean, I think the ceiling is you have one of the best offenses in the country. I mean, you talk about it, the receiving core should be the best in the country. The tight end room might be the best in the country. I think, you pair that receivers, tight ends, running backs. I don't know that there's another team in college football that can quite match the Buckeyes in terms of how much talent they have in terms of those offensive playmakers. And so you start there. Again, I think the offensive line should be pretty good. Like I think that I feel better about where the offensive line is at this time of year than I have at this time a lot of recent years. So I think I can't say yet whether the offensive line will be a strength, but I don't think it'll be a weakness. I think it's going to be at least solid. Again, the biggest question is at quarterback because you're going to have a quarterback who has never started a college game before. And so that's really kind of where the difference is between the ceiling and the floor is a lot of it is going to come down to how good is Julian Sayin or whoever that starting quarterback is. If Julian Sayin lives up to the hype that he came in with a recruit, I mean, this could easily be a top five offense in the country. If he goes through some struggles, then there could be some growing pains, particularly early in the season as he gains that experience.
And both Ohio State and Texas facing off there in week one. They both have some youngsters that are going to be having to step up in pretty big positions. Looking over to the Buckeye defense, so this was arguably the best defense in the country last year. Is it what? How many guys went off to the NFL from this defense? It was a lot.
Eight starters were drafted.
Man, that's crazy. So when you look at the defense this year, I think the biggest question mark has got to be up front defensively, and we'll start there. Defensive line. I know the Buckeyes were looking in the transfer portal for some guys, for some quick impact players for this fall. What is the expectation, I guess, around the Buckeye program for the defensive line? Are there any concerns here, or is it they just won't be as good as last year?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think you'd have to anticipate there's probably going to be a step back on the defensive line because you lost four really good players and JT Tuimoloau, Tyleik Williams, Jack Sawyer, and Ty Hamilton. I think the biggest concern right now, at least that I have, is a defensive tackle. I think that's probably the biggest position of concern on the entire team, and I think the starters are going to be good. I think Caden McDonald and Edric Houston both have the potential to be really, really good players. I think the concern right now is the depth behind them because they just there wasn't really a clear sign this spring that any of those guys behind them were really ready to play significant snaps this year. And then Ohio State wasn't able to add a defensive tackle in the transfer portal. And so I think that the big concern right now is just are they going to be able to rotate at defensive tackle? And if not, then, how well can Edric Houston and Caden McDonald hold up if you're asking them to play 50, 60 snaps in a big game? And so to me, defensive tackle is the biggest position of concern and a potential weakness for this Ohio State team. I think the defensive end rotation should be pretty deep. I mean, they added two transfers in Bo Atkinson from North Carolina, Logan George from Idaho State. You bring back Kenyatta Jackson Jr. and Caden Curry, who are the top backups this last year. And then you also have CJ Hicks, a former five-star recruit who's making that move from linebacker to edge rusher. So between those five guys, you feel like they should be able to have a pretty good defensive end rotation. Maybe they won't quite have that star off the edge like they had a couple of this past year with JT and Jack, but I think collectively they should be able to have a good defensive end rotation for sure.
And in the linebacker room, so Sonny Styles returns. Last year, I felt like in terms of going into the year with the star names, the linebacking core didn't have as many star names as the defensive line and the secondary did. Do you think the linebackers might be the strength of the defense this year?
I think they absolutely could be. I think Sonny Styles is a guy that you saw last year make that transition from safety to linebacker, and I think he got better and better as the year progressed. And now that he's got that year of experience under his belt, I mean, he's a guy that's incredibly physically gifted, also a very mature, hard worker. I think he could make another big jump this year and has a chance to be one of the best linebackers in the country. And then I think Arvell Reese, he's got some big shoes to fill because Cody Simon had a really good year last year at Mike linebacker. But from what we saw from Arvell Reese a year ago, playing as that number three linebacker, he's another guy who has star potential. And so I think, he's a guy who should be ready to step up into that starting Mike linebacker role. And then Peyton Pierce is another guy that Ohio State really likes going into his second year. He's going to be that number three linebacker this year. And, James Laurinaitis has gushed about him every time that we've had an opportunity to talk to him. And so I think with those three guys in particular, I think Ohio State feels really good about the top of its linebacker depth chart.
And the depth here. when you look at like years in the future here, it looks really good because there's a lot of high upside from a lot of the youngsters in the linebacking room. So yeah, bright future ahead for the Buckeyes at linebacker. In the secondary, so Caleb Downs returns, and out of all the investments last year, he may have been the biggest. He and then Davison is back as well in the secondary at corner. Um, do you think this group has a chance to be as good as last year?
It's certainly not out of a question. I mean, you have again Caleb Downs coming back is massive because he's the biggest star of the entire defense. Davison Igbinosun coming back now for his third year as a starter. I think Jermaine Matthews Jr. has a chance to be one of the best corners in the country as well. I think him stepping up into that starting role. I think he's been ready for that, and I think him stepping up into that role now. I think he has a chance to be a breakout star for this Ohio State defense this year. The two question mark positions would be the nickel position and the second starting safety, replacing two really good players there in Jordan Hancock and Lathan Ransom. And so when you ask, could they be as good as last year? My hesitancy would be at those two spots because I think Jordan Hancock and Lathan Ransom were probably two of the more underrated players on Ohio State last year in terms of how vital they were, as good as Caleb Downs was. Both of those guys also played a very vital role in that safety and secondary position. And so I think a lot of it's going to depend on how do the other safeties and nickels step up around him. And I think there's a lot of promise there. I think Malik Hartford and Jalen McLean both had really good springs, and I think both of them, whether it be a rotation at that second safety spot, whether we see more free safety looks under Matt Patricia, I think we're going to see both Malik and Jalen play a good amount this year. And then Lorenzo Styles Jr., the older brother of Sonny Styles, he looks like he's probably in line to be that starting nickel, and I think he had a good spring as well. So I think the potential for the secondary is very high. And I think in general, Ohio State's defensive back seven probably should be one of the best in the country. But, there are a couple positions there that, still got to prove themselves out.
So the special teams department last year was not the strength of the team. Has the kicking game improved, you think?
Well, I think Jaden Fielding, really has a renewed sense of confidence going into this year based on the way that he finished off last season. We didn't know this at the time, but he revealed this spring that he was actually kicking with a torn muscle in his hip from the third week of his season. And so I
Wow.
think, some of the ups and downs that we saw from him, particularly against Michigan, were related to the fact that he was kicking through an injury. And so I think the way he finished the year, ultimately making the game sealing kick in the national championship game, I think that gave him, a renewed sense of confidence. And I think he has a chance to be one of the better kickers in college football this year. But they also brought in a Ball State transfer, Jackson Corville, who was really good at Ball
Yeah.
State for the last 2 years. And so that gives some competition, kind of, forces Jaden Fielding to be at his best because part of the problem last year was he was dealing with that injury. They really didn't have a backup that they could turn to. Now they have that. So I think they've got two kickers that they feel good about, which gives them the chance for that kicking game to be a strength when, like you said, it really wasn't a year ago. I think at punter, I think Joe McGuire was solid last year. He'll get pushed a little bit this offseason by Nick McLarty, is a young punter that they brought in on scholarship a year ago that they really like. But I think, at worst, they should be solid there. John Furlman back for his third year at long snapper. So I think the special teams are in a good place. Will they be a strength of Ohio State? That remains to be seen. But I think they feel pretty good about where they're at based on the fact that, they are bringing back all their starting specialists.
Name a player you think that has a chance to go from someone that not too many people maybe outside of Ohio State know about, but you think could become a household name this fall.
I mentioned him a couple minutes ago, but I'll bring him up again. Jermaine Matthews Jr. I think he's a guy who, has all the tools to be that next elite cornerback from Ohio State. We've seen it. I mean, his freshman year, he gets called upon to play a ton against Penn State because Denzel Burke was hurt and he was awesome. And last year, I think it was the Cotton Bowl. It was one of the CFP games. Denzel Burke got hurt again, and he stepped in there, played the whole second half, and did a great job. And so, I think he's a guy who's ready to be a star in that secondary. And I think even with Davison coming back, I wouldn't be surprised if Jermaine Matthews Jr. is Ohio State's top corner this year.
So for the Buckeyes this fall, it feels like Ohio State, Georgia, Texas, Oregon, if you want to throw them in as well, Penn State, Notre Dame. There are a lot of teams to me that seem pretty similar in terms of power ratings at the top of college football this year. It feels like a little bit of a wide open year when you look at the top of college football. So I asked Jordan Hill, who works for Dogs 24/7 for Georgia, the same question. When you look at Ohio State this year, obviously ceiling is, hey, we can win the national championship because we're just that talented. But what do you think if you were to simulate the season, say 10 times? What's the most likely simulation? And then what do you think ultimately is going to be the story of the 2025 Buckeyes?
I'd say in terms of regular season record, I would say the most likely record for me is 10-2 because they are replacing so many starters from last year that you expect there to be some growing pains. And so I do think that there, will probably be a couple of losses along the way. But, the good news for Ohio State, just like we saw last year when they lost 2 games in a regular season, is, 10-2 is good enough to get you in the college football playoff now, especially, if the schedule Ohio State has this year starting off with Texas. And so, I think Ohio State, I say 10-2. I think is the most likely record, but I think Ohio State will make the college football playoff. I can't say that I'm necessarily ready this far out to say how far do I think they go. Would I pick Ohio State right now to repeat as national champions? The answer is no, because they're just replacing so much from a year ago that I think to say that I think they're going to win it all this season, I think would be a little bit overly optimistic. But to your point, the potential's there. Like anything is possible for Ohio State because they are the roster, even with all the guys they lost, their roster still is as talented as any team in the country. But
Absolutely.
they are relying on more guys than they were a year ago who don't have a ton of experience. And so I think the question is going to be how quickly can they close that gap, and then can they do what they did last year, which is really peak at the right time? Can they get better and better to where in December and January they're playing their best football? If they are, anything is possible. But if I had to sit here right now and say, do I think Ohio State wins the national championship? Right now, I would say no.
And it's amazing when you look across college football right now. Like, if somebody asked me the same question, like, "Hey, Connor, who do you think's winning the national championship?" I would not have a straight up answer for that. It's a very tough question for the 2025 college football season. Well, Dan, really good job. Of course, we were expecting very high things from you, and we certainly got that. So, Dan, again, really good job on the channel today. Thank you for being here, and we are really looking forward to watching the 2025 college football season, of course, and Ohio State. So thank you for being on the channel, and we'll look to have you on again next year.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me, Connor.